Many Magic cards have become iconic in their own right, often thanks to just how powerful they are. Sometimes Wizards will look at these cards and decide to make a card very similar to them, often toning them down to try to make them more fair than their original versions. However, sometimes they go too far in nerfing these cards, giving us cards that are more pale imitations of the old cards as opposed to love letters to them. So today, we're going to go over the absolute worst of these callback cards and explain why they failed to capture the magic of their originals. And starting off at number 10, we have Torchling. This is a 3/3 shapeshifter with a mana cost of 3 and 2 red, and 5 separate activated abilities. You can pay 1 red mana to either untap the Torchling, force target creature to block it this turn, or change the target of a spell that only targets Torchling. Finally, you can pay 1 generic to either give it -1/+1 or +1/-1 until end of turn. Now, this is a riff on the classic card Morphling, which was one of the most terrifying creatures in the game when it was printed. Thanks to the ability to gain Shroud for 1 mana, making it completely untargetable, Morphling was essentially impossible for your opponent to remove. Combine this with its powerful stat-modifying abilities, flying, and the ability to untap itself made Morphling a 1-card army. Torchling couldn't quite do this, though, as its abilities are notably worse than Morphling's in a few key ways. For one, its former protection is a lot worse. If there's not another creature on field for you to change the removal spell to, you can't activate the ability. This makes Torchling a lot worse as a control finisher, which is the main place that the Morphlings have seen play. While the ability to force an opponent to block it with a particular creature can be very powerful in the right circumstances, you're often going to be behind on board when you play Torchling because of its subpar stats before you start warping them. The untap ability is nice, but not good enough to patch up the card's flaws, as it was still quite a bad attacker and blocker. A big part of Torchling's failure to take off is honestly the fact that, by the time of Planar Chaos when Torchling was released, Morphling wasn't a particularly good card. Morphling's dominance over early Magic was only able to happen thanks to the fact that most creatures in early Magic were hilariously bad, and the fact that damage used to use the stack. It's a bit of a complicated ruling to get into, but the gist of it is that back in the day, instead of damage all being dealt at once during the damage step, each creature would put its damage onto the stack like an ability. Players would get priority, and then damage would happen. This made abilities like Morphling's stat modifying far better, as it could be pumped up to 5 power, put 5 damage on the stack, and then transform into a 0/6 when damage was actually dealt. Wizards removed this rule because it was really stupid that cards like Morphling could abuse the ruling this way. But the point here is that the stat warping ability is a lot weaker than it used to be. Without the stat warping letting the card perform well in combat, Torchling has to lean on a lot of its other abilities to be relevant, and they're unfortunately just okay and not amazing. Now, there are other versions of Morphling for all the other colors, but they're a lot better than Torchling thanks to coming out later. Thornling, the green Morphling, was a 4/4 for 5 mana, so its stats were much better and could straight up gain Indestructible as a form of protection. Brightling, the white member of the cycle, was a 3/3 for 3 mana, so its stats were already okay before you get to any of its abilities. And Endling, the black member of the cycle, was a 4 mana 3/3, but thanks to being able to gain Undying, it could become a 4/4, a much better Starling. None of these cards could quite live up to the legend of Morphling, but they were at least acceptably strong. Red really got the short end of the stick by getting its version first, as Wizards wasn't yet willing to pump up the power level of the cards as they needed to. And at number 9, we have Delusions of Mediocrity. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 and 1 blue. It is the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you gain 10 life, and when it leaves the battlefield, you lose 10 life. This is a reference to the card Illusions of Grandeur, which has the same mana cost, but makes you gain and lose 20 life instead. However, it also has the cumulative upkeep mechanic, so every turn you have to pay more and more mana to keep Illusions around. All of this makes Illusions an all-around awful card, usually. However, there was a specific interaction that made Illusions very powerful. Donate is a sorcery for 2 and 1 blue that simply gives an opponent control of a permanent you control. Thanks to the way Illusions is worded, if you donate it to your opponent, you'll get to keep the 20 life it gave you permanently, even if it leaves the field later on. Even more importantly, if it does leave the field under your opponent's control, they'll lose 20 life instead of you. Thanks to the card's cumulative upkeep, this will happen sooner rather than later. This was essentially a 2-card combo that automatically won you the game, leading to a deck called Tricks, in the now defunct extended format. Now, Delusions of Mediocrity is pretty terrible as part of a donate combo. Not only does it not have cumulative upkeep to remove itself from the field, but even if you do use a Naturalize to remove your opponent's delusions, you'll only have their life total. All of these extra hoops you have to jump through make using delusions as a combo piece kind of terrible. This means that you have to use it as a fair life gain tool, which is also not that great. Life gain cards just aren't all that amazing when gaining life is all they do. Delusions life gain isn't even all that great on rate. Yes, 10 life is a lot, but 4 mana to gain a ton of life also sets you back a good deal in terms of tempo. It can be worth it, but the fact that any opponent with access to enchantment removal can undo it with a single card makes relying on it to keep yourself alive extremely risky. Delusions likely wasn't intended to be a competitively viable card, but it's still kind of sad to see such an iconic card reduced to something this bad. And at number 8, we have Vessel of Volatility. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has the ability where you can pay 1 and 1 red and sacrifice Vessel to add 4 red mana. This is a pretty classic take on a ritual effect, an effect that's been redone so often it's kind of debatable if Vessel is a clear enough reference to belong on this list. It's essentially a much worse version of Pyretic Ritual, though Pyretic itself is a nerfed dark ritual. However you feel about these semantics, rituals have generally been very strong throughout the history of Magic. Despite Pyretic taking up an entire card to give you only 1 extra mana, it and cards in the same vein have seen tons of play as parts of various combo decks. Pyretic Ritual, in particular, has historically seen some play in Blue-Red Storm in Modern. This deck would chain a ton of rituals together with the help of Past in Flames to rack up a high storm count and then one-shot your opponent with Grape Shot later on in the turn. The extra mana the rituals produced was pretty important to allowing this combo to work, as otherwise you simply couldn't afford to cast enough spells to build up your storm count high enough to actually win. Other decks, such as Charbelcher Combo, also rely heavily on rituals to generate the mana necessary to perform their combo. Vessel has never been used in this way because it isn't ever actually mana positive. It costs a total of 4 mana to play and activate Vessel, and it only gives you 4 mana when you pop it, so you're only ever mana neutral in the interaction. Rather than generating mana, Vessel just allows you to store mana from one turn to the next, which is extremely different. For one, it makes it very weak as a top deck. If you're holding an expensive spell you want to ramp into and top deck a Vessel, you'll have to wait yet another turn to even profit off a Vessel to play the card. This is a huge tempo hit to the card, which is pretty awful considering that tempo is all Vessel has going for it. Having to wait an entire turn to use Vessel also hurts a lot because your opponent can see it coming. Any blue player can leave up mana for a counterspell to stop whatever big card you're saving all the mana up for, and completely blow you out. And every other deck can at least hold up interaction to stop you from doing that much with the mana. They can even stop you from getting the mana at all with a card like Reclamation Sage, completely blowing you out of tempo. Vessel is essentially what happens when you take literally all the positive aspects of rituals away. It's kind of surprising how scared they were of this effect when Treasure Fever would start in just a few sets later in Excellent Block, which is essentially the same thing as Vessel, except way better on raid and more versatile as well. Rituals are a difficult mechanic to balance, as they're very easy to make too good, but this is going way too far in the other direction. And at number 7, we have Faithless Salvaging. This is an instant for 1 and 1 red with the effect where you discard a card and then draw a card. It also has Rebound, meaning that after you cast it from your hand, you exile it. Then, at the beginning of your next upkeep, you cast the spell without paying its mana cost. This is one of the many revamps of the card, Faithless Looting, and once again, it failed to recapture what made the original card so good. Looting is a card that simply allows you to draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards, and it has a flashback for 2 and 1 red, letting you recast it from your graveyard once, but it goes to exile afterward. Looting was an amazing tool for graveyard decks, allowing you to put key cards into the graveyard for later, a role it excelled at to such a degree that it ended up being banned in Modern. The thing is, the most important thing about looting is that it only costs 1 mana. Looting already had competition in cards like Cathartic Reunion for cards in the same color that could allow you to dump cards into your graveyard and draw other cards. But these were worse simply because they cost more mana. Even cards like Faithful Mending, which has the same exact effect as looting but better, haven't seen too much play in the format simply thanks to costing 2 mana to use up front, though being in different colors does make this comparison less apt. Salvaging trades the efficiency that put looting on the map for a series of mostly irrelevant upsides. The main draw of salvaging over other similar cards is the fact that it doesn't actually require you to discard a card for it to do anything. If salvaging is the only card in your hand when you cast it, you'll discard no cards and still draw thanks to the discard not being a cost of the spell, like with Cathartic Reunion, or having an if clause like Thrilling Discovery. This means that salvaging can actually get you card disadvantage, as if you're emptying your hand and play the card, then play whatever you draw off of it before your next upkeep, you can draw 2 cards for free off of a single card. You could also just cast Ren's Resolve and get access to 2 more cards right away, which is far better than what salvaging can do. Even in terms of just trying to fill your graveyard, salvaging is quite bad. You can't bin the cards you draw off of salvaging like you can with looting, and you can't even draw multiple cards in your hand at the time of casting like you can with Reunion. Salvaging is a bad mix of multiple different effects, halfway between a way to draw cards and a way to dump cards into the graveyard. Unfortunately, it's better to do one thing well than it is to do multiple things poorly. And at number 6, we have Fraying Omnipotence. This is a sorcery with the mana cost of 3 and 2 black. It has the effect where each player loses half their life, discards half of the cards in their hand, and sacrifices half the creatures they control, rounded up. This is a take on the card Pox, a sorcery for 3 black with a very strange effect. This makes each player lose a third of their life, discard a third of their cards in their hand, sacrifice a third of the creatures they control, and sacrifice a third of the lands they control, all rounded up. Now, making players calculate how much a third of their lands, creatures, and cards in hand are is very annoying. But it's not as annoying as getting to eat 2 of your opponent's land off of a 3-mana spell if they have 4 lands out. The fact that Pox rounds up allowed it to be the backbone of a lot of mono-black strategies throughout the years, thanks in no small part to Dark Ritual letting you play it off of a single swamp. Pox is both powerful and extremely frustrating, which is why future versions of the effect were made much worse. Omnipotence is one of those much worse versions of the card. Omnipotence is kind of just bad at everything. Having your opponent's life total can be okay, but it's not quite as good as you'd like it to be. Often your opponent will still be at a pretty healthy life total. So whatever creatures you have left after sacking to Omnipotence will have a difficult time ending the game even after their life is halved. Making your opponent discard can be rough, but since it comes down so late into the game, they'll often either be able to discard bad cards to keep their late game threats in hand, or will just be empty-handed. Forcing them to sacrifice creatures is also good, but if they have a lot of tokens around or something like that, it just isn't all that impactful. You really just want to use it when they have exactly 1 creature on the field to kill it, making it a worse Diabolic Edict. The thing is, by far, the most important part of Pox is that it eats your opponent's lands. Losing cards in hand and several lands off of 1 spell makes it very difficult for your opponent to play at all, and Pox decks takes advantage of this failure to even play cards like the Rack and end the game. Without the ability to eat lands, any Pox effect loses most of what makes it powerful, as the effects, while strong, are not something you'd always want to use. Interestingly, there are more successful versions of this effect, such as Wrinkle's Prank, which lets you choose 1 or more of the modes. This allows you to only use the Pox effects that are good for you at the time, making it far easier to justify playing the card. If Fraying Omnipotence had a similar model aspect, it would be a lot better. But having to go through the same punishment as your opponent regardless of the board state just makes it way too clunky to use. And at number 5, we have Seer. This is a 2/2 human wizard with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It has the ability where, when it becomes untapped, you reveal the top card of your deck and put it into your hand, then lose life equal to its mana value. Seer is a riff on Dark Confidant, which is a 2/1 for the same cost that does the same draw effect, but just during your upkeep instead of when it becomes untapped. Confidant has been a powerful draw engine for black for a long time, and while it has been power crept out of formats like Modern more recently, it's still a good bar for what makes a good creature that draws cards. A big reason for this is that Confidant gives you a draw as soon as your next turn starts. Yes, your opponent can stop you from drawing with a lightning bolt on their following turn, but it's a 2-mana spell. You're not losing that much if they do kill it, and you can sneak it in early and get a draw surprisingly often. However, Seer can't really do this thanks to how Inspired works. In order to get the ability to trigger, you have to first tap the card, which is usually done by attacking. To attack, you have to wait a full turn. So you have to wait a turn to attack, then actually get through combat successfully and wait an entire turn, and then you finally get to draw your card, Waiting a full 2 turns to draw is bad enough, but the biggest weakness of Pain Seer is that it's a pretty awful creature in terms of attacking. Your opponent can easily block Pain Seer and either trade or just outright beat it in combat, stopping you from getting any value from the creature at all. Compared to a better revamp of Confidant, Glint Sleeve Siphoner. This is a 2/1 with Menace for 2 mana, Menace meaning it can't be blocked by less than 2 creatures. It makes an energy when it enters or attacks, and during your upkeep you can pay 2 energy to draw a card and lose a life. This is actually a lot worse than Pain Seer in terms of being able to draw, requiring 2 turns of attacking to get a draw after the first. But it was a much stronger card just because Menace allowed it to actually attack somewhat consistently. Pain Seer is so easy to stop because realistically, your opponent will be doing one of 2 things at any time in a game, developing their board or interacting with yours. Both of those things stop Pain Seer from being able to attack and generate value, because its body is so weak. Pain Seer is a victim of Wizards overvaluing the power of Dark Confidant a bit. The card is good, but it's been past its prime for a while, and they really could have pushed the callbacks to it a bit more without breaking standard. And at number 4, we have Restore Balance. This is a white sorcery with no mana cost, meaning it can't be cast from your hand normally. Instead, you have to use Suspend. This is a mechanic that allows you to pay a cost to exile the card from your hand with a number of time counters. During your upkeep, you remove a time counter from the card, and when the last is removed, you can cast the spell without paying its mana cost. Restore Balance has Suspend 6, meaning you have to wait 6 turns for it to finally resolve after suspending it. With such a long wait, Restore Balance needs to have a very powerful effect. And luckily it does. Restore Balance forces each player to get rid of lands, creatures, and cards in their hand until they have the same number as whichever player has the least. This is the exact same effect as Balance from all the way back in Alpha, which had this effect at 1 and 1 white. Balance was, ironically, one of the least balanced cards in the game. Balance could be used as a 2-mana Wrath of God in Armageddon at the same time, or a 2-mana Mind Twist if your hand was low on cards. This means that, similar to Pox, with the right setup, you can lock your opponent out of being able to do anything for the rest of the game. Now, Restore Balance can do this too. Some players have had success by using Greater Gargadon to sacrifice all of their land and creatures right before Restore Balance resolves, or more realistically, by getting around the suspend downside with a card like As Foretold. However, all of this requires getting a lot of cards together. A 3-card combo if you don't want to wait through 6 turns of setup, and if your opponent responds with counter magic, you essentially lose the game right there. This is only really an issue against blue decks, but combo remains a gimmick regardless. Waiting 6 turns just isn't an option in almost any format of Magic. Any aggro or mid-range deck will be able to outrun you and end the game before it comes off its timer, and Control will easily be able to find some form of counter magic. This means you have to use another card to cheat out Restore Balance, at which point the combo is too clunky to work. Balance is honestly another card whose power is a bit overestimated. The card is very good, but the biggest problem is really that it just makes the game completely miserable. Wizards mostly makes the effects worse, not just because they're too good, but because if they ever are good, the metagame becomes completely intolerable. So yes, Restore Balance is much, much worse than the original version of the card it's based on, but that's probably for the best. And at number 3, we have Magus of the Bridge. This is a 4/4 human wizard with a mana cost of 3 black. It is the abilities where, whenever a non-token creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. However, whenever a creature is put into an opponent's graveyard from the battlefield, you exile the Magus. Now, the Maguses are a large group of creatures that are essentially versions of old, powerful cards, but on creatures instead. Magus of the Bridge is a reference to the card Bridge from Below, an enchantment for 3 black with a very similar set of abilities. However, it will create zombies when your creatures die while it's in the graveyard, and will get exiled from your graveyard when an opponent's creature dies. In fact, Bridge from Below doesn't even do anything while it's on the battlefield, besides giving you 3 extra devotion to black, I suppose. This means that Magus of the Bridge is essentially the only Magus that isn't actually a copy of the card it's imitating. It's closer to Magus of the Open Graves, except with an additional downside tacked on. Now, there is a reason why Wizards did this. Bridge from Below is an incredibly strong card thanks to the fact that you don't actually have to pay any mana to get its effect. Anything that you don't have to spend mana to do is pretty much automatically broken in Magic. This would also mean the fact that Magus would be a creature would be completely irrelevant to how the card plays, which would kind of break the identity of the Magus cycle. So there were some challenges in designing a Magus of the Bridge, but if the concessions you had to make to design the card were this bad, why make the card at all? Magus has done literally nothing since it was introduced in Modern Horizons 2, and it's not likely to start doing anything anytime soon. And at number 2, we have Mox Tantalite. This is an artifact with no mana cost and suspend 3 for 0, very similar to Restore Balance. It has the ability where you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. This is a reference to the Moxen of the Power 9 fame. These are some of the most broken cards ever printed, thanks to essentially just being better lands, and Wizards has released nerfed versions of them over and over again. Mox Tantalite is one of the few versions of a Moxen that is actually straight up bad, which is kind of impressive. The thing about Mox Tantalite is that it's literally only good if it's in your opening hand, and even then, it's not that crazy. If you open Mox Tantalite, then on turn 4 it will come off Suspend, you will have 1 extra mana, which can be really useful. However, if you ever top deck it on a later turn, then it won't be active for another 3 turns, pushing it back towards turn 5 or later, at which point getting 1 extra mana won't really be worth it. The thing about Tantalite is that it's honestly just a rampant growth in disguise. Yes, you don't have to spend any mana up front, but spending mana right now to get more mana next turn has proven to be a worthy trade several times in Magic's history. Importantly, you start benefiting from the extra mana as soon as your next turn, allowing you to instantly start clawing back the tempo you lost. Tantalite making you wait for several turns to get this benefit makes it very difficult to justify including, considering that it's a dead draw in the late game. Interestingly, Tantalite was preceded by another callback to another piece of the Power 9 mana ramp in Lotus Bloom, which is also an artifact with no mana cost and suspend 3 for 0 mana. Bloom, in contrast to Tantalite, has actually seen a decent amount of competitive play, and not just because it was released earlier, before the game was as powerful as it is now. Even in the modern day, certain combo decks use Bloom to accelerate into their plays on turn 4. This is because Bloom gives you 3 mana of any one color in exchange for sacrificing it, which is extremely powerful just because of how much tempo it gives you. The difference between having 4 mana on turn 4 and having 7 is way bigger than a difference between 4 and 5, and it allows you to do things like cast Ad Nauseam and Angel's Grace in the same turn that Tantalite just can't. This extra mana was so good that a few decks would use Reshape to sacrifice an artifact to cheat a Bloom out of their deck if they had a good way to abuse it. Now, you could cheat Mox Tantalite out of your deck with Reshape as well, but that would literally just be casting Rampant Growth with extra steps. People will do almost anything to play a Moxen, whether it be playing a ton of legends to turn them on, or throwing away extra cards. But the one thing they won't do is wait 3 turns. And all the way at number 1, we have Diamond Lion. This is a 2/2 cat artifact creature with a mana cost of 2. It is the ability where you tap it, discard your hand, and sacrifice Diamond Lion to add 3 mana of any one color, but you can only activate this as an instant. This is a reference to Lion's Eye Diamond, which is itself a reference to Black Lotus. LED was a fixed Black Lotus of sorts, still costing 0 mana and making 3, but requiring you to pitch your entire hand to use the ability, which was supposed to make the card completely worthless. Of course, they did eventually have to change its ability once the rules around mana production were changed. As with the original wording, which lacked the only activate as an instant clause, you could go to cast a spell and then use LED with the spell already in the casting process to add mana, essentially removing the biggest part of LED's downside, as you could just use the mana to cast a spell from your hand. Even with the nerf, however, LED proved to be very strong. Players found ways to use LED at certain points in a combo to maximize its value, by casting a card like Infernal Tutor or Night's Whisper, and then activating LED, you can get your mana and then fill your hand with spells to cast with that mana. This is especially good with Infernal Tutor, as it can tutor any card into your hand with this combo. Now, Diamond Lion can do all of these things, but it hasn't ever done anything for a couple of reasons. The first problem with Diamond Lion is that, well, isn't it just kind of a vessel of volatility? You spend 2 mana on one turn and then wait a turn to get 3 mana back, which, while it is a bigger tempo swing, it does require waiting to be able to perform your combo, giving your opponent more counterplay. Diamond Lion gives your opponent way more counterplay than other similar cards as well, as it can be destroyed by any creature or artifact removal, meaning most decks can deny you your big combo turn with any interaction. All of this together means that Diamond competes directly with cards like Strike It Rich, which just gives you a treasure for 1 mana, letting you use that 1 mana at any time for the rest of the game. Now, while this card does have less of an impact on the game, It also doesn't ask for you to find a very specific card to combine it with in order for it to do anything worthwhile. Lion is effectively a 2-card combo, but it's a 2-card combo that requires a turn of setup, is extremely easy for any color to disrupt, and doesn't even win you the game on its own when you pull it off. Sure, you will probably be able to combo it into a win, but you're still weak to hate cards like a Mind Break Trap depending on how exactly you're trying to pull off the combo. Diamond Lion is probably the biggest downgrade in all of Magic. It's amazing how you can take an effect that was thought to be so unfixable and make it so slow and easy to stop that players have all but forgotten about its existence entirely.